Look, I'll be very upfront, guys. I'm more of a handheld PC person. I've had my Steam Deck since it released, and that's been my way of playing games for the most part. And even outside of that, I'm more of a PC gamer and, sometimes console here and there. However, I have loved handhelds ever since I can remember. And that is what initially interested me about the AYN Thor. And honestly, after using it as much as I have fallen in love with it and think it is the perfect companion to go along with the Steam Deck, thanks to its completely more portable style and the dual screens, which gives it a completely different experience than what you can get on single screen handhelds. And ultimately, even if you don't have a handheld PC, I still highly recommend getting this because not only is it perfect for emulation, especially DS and 3DS emulation, it is also capable of playing some Steam games and, of course, all the Android games that may not run as well on handheld PCs like the Steam Deck. After using the AYN Thor for weeks and trying it out in multitude of ways, I can confidently say that the Thor is probably the best companion to go along with a handheld PC like the Steam Deck, like the Ally, like the Legion Go, because it gives a completely different experience thanks to its better portability and the dual screens that it has. It is fantastic, and I can't see myself going anywhere with just my Steam Deck anymore, as I'm just going to be putting this right in my pocket with me. So there are 4 models of the Thor. There's the Lite, Base, Pro, and Max models. The Base, Pro, and Max models only really differ through their RAM and storage configurations. The Base has 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage, Pro has 12GB of RAM and 256GB of storage, and the Max has 16GB of RAM and 1TB of storage. The Lite version has the same configuration as the Base, which is 8GB of RAM and 120GB of storage, but there are some very key differences between that Lite model and the Base, Pro, and Max models. For starters, the Lite model has a completely different processor inside. It has a Snapdragon 865, while the Base, Pro, and Max models have a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Now, the Snapdragon 865 is still very capable, and you should be able to do a good chunk with it. However, the price difference between the Lite and the Base model is only $50, and I would recommend getting the new processor, the 8 Gen 2, over the 865 just based on price alone. However, there are some other differences that come into play. The Lite is using slower RAM using LPDDR4 RAM, while the Base, Pro, and Max models have LPDDR5. It also has faster storage using UFS 4.0, while the Lite has UFS 3.1. Both battery sizes are exactly the same at 6,000 mAh, but the Wi-Fi chip inside the Lite model is Wi-Fi 6 with Bluetooth 5.1, whereas in the Base, Pro, and Max model we have Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3. Both devices have a USB 3.1 Type-C port right on the bottom with a 3.5mm audio jack and a micro SD card slot. However, because of the newer chip, the video output that's possible on the Base, Pro, and Max models is 4K at 60 frames per second, whereas on the Lite model, it's only at 1080p. Both are going to come with Android 13, have the exact same size, and the same weight. As for the model AYN sent me, I have the Base model, so I have 128GB of storage, 8GB of RAM, and I'm using the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip. Now, I think this is going to be great for general use, Android gaming, and emulation. There should be no problems here whatsoever. The only time I would say that you might need a little bit more RAM is going to be when you're trying to play Steam games on here using GameNative or GameHub. However, for general use, I would say this model is going to be the perfect balance between everything that you're going to need. All right, so this is actually the box that the AYN Thor is going to ship to you in, and it's a nice box. It's sleek and everything, and over here it has the model and the color that you're going to be getting. So here's mine with the Base 8 plus 128GB and the color black. So pretty easy to open. Just go ahead and open it up in here. Your Thor will be in here wrapped in a package, and there is a cable that comes along with it, though the cable is already out for me. So this right here is going to be the Thor. And if it looks like a DS to you, that's because it really, really looks like a DS. But let's go ahead and start with the actual quality of the build itself. For the most part, it's really solid, and it stays on that fine line of being a premium device while still being pretty weightless. I have this weird thing where if it's too light, it kind of feels cheap. But the Thor kind of, teeters the line. It's weightless enough to where it's really easy to hold and carry around, but it still has enough weight to it where it feels actually like it's made of good material. And for the most part, I would say it is. So here we have the Thor. The outside is completely plastic, so is going to be plastic all around. The plastic itself feels pretty nice. For the most part, I would say the bottom of it actually feels a little bit more smooth and easy to grip onto than the top, which makes sense because when we're holding the device, our fingers are going to be along the back here. So it makes sense that the bottom has to feel a little bit better to use with our hands. But the top still feels pretty okay. Everything in general feels very tight though. And that is the biggest part, is you want this to feel like there are no cracks anywhere alongside, and it all sticks together pretty well. The only issue I would have with the outside quality is actually right over here. You see there's 2 indents right over here. So there is enough space here where the screen can actually press down. And when it presses down, it actually takes the joystick and pushes it down. So I'm not sure if you can hear it, but that's actually the screen clicking the joystick, and can happen on both sides. It does take a decent amount of force to actually push it down, but otherwise there's really no issue with the outside build quality. Right on the inside though, we have 2 glass screens. So this is glass and this is glass, both casing the screens and going around the buttons. It feels very, very smooth, and it has this premium look to it. So when you look at it, it actually feels more like a premium device, which I would consider, compared to other Android devices, it is. I have no issues with this whatsoever. There is some stains that can show up, especially if you're on if you're using the black version of the device. You know, black does show up smudges a little bit easier, but it still looks really, really nice. I really enjoy the look of the device. I honestly don't really have that many complaints when it comes to the build quality of it. So I would say it's a very solidly built device. It has, the weight would be the one thing where I would be the most critical, but weight-wise, it really does sit right in the middle of too weightless or too light and too heavy. And the size of it is perfect. So, and as I said, it does look and feel like a DS, and that's because, well, that's what it's trying to emulate the most of. But the size of it is perfect to fit in your pocket. Now, as a handheld PC user and an avid Steam Deck user, I like to compare it to the device I'm going to bring around most of the time, which is the Steam Deck. However, the Steam Deck can't really fit in my pocket. I mean, technically it can, but it sticks out. The Thor is significantly smaller. So this is much more easy to fit in my pocket. So when I am going or traveling, I'll usually put the Steam Deck in my backpack, and the Thor would go right in my pocket. And it fits perfectly. There's really no complaints when it comes to actually taking this around. Now, there are Android devices that are significantly smaller than the Thor, but with the Thor, you are getting dual screens, and it feels much better to use than a lot of those other smaller handhelds that I've encountered. So I would still say the Thor is going to be the best of both worlds in this case. It's still going to be great for emulation, and it's going to be great to take around, but it's still a little bit bigger than those much smaller devices. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the actual design. So that was the build quality. It's very solid, but the design of the device itself. So let's start with the button layout, because this is really going to be where you're going to be spending most of your time with the Thor, is using it like it's a controller and playing games on it. The overall button layout of the front screen or the bottom screen is pretty much decent. It does the job. It's really great. It feels good. I can reach everywhere with my fingers. And interestingly enough, I thought I was going to have an issue with the sunken joysticks, because the joysticks in here are a little bit sunken to, allow you to close the device to where you need to. It really wasn't that bad. I have very fat hands, so I thought my thumbs would have a little bit more trouble kind of getting around and feeling comfortable, but it's not that bad at all. But I do enjoy the button layout more than I expected. I always appreciate the start and select button being on 2 opposite sides. I've seen a lot of handhelds where they have it on the same side, like right down here. I actually like that the 2 buttons are right up here. There's the back and the home button right down here as well, which is really easy to get to, and again, separated. I appreciate that. And then there's going to be this AYN button over here, which I'll go into a little bit later, but it is very, very helpful, and I honestly love it. I also really like the triggers. So the L1 and R1, they have a nice click to it, but they're not, I wouldn't say they're amazing. They're there. They're good. They're big enough to where you can hit them really easily. However, these triggers, I actually really, really like. Now, again, fat hands, I always get worried about small triggers. These triggers are still a little bit on the small side, but they feel fantastic. They have enough resistance to it where I can push it down halfway and I still feel like it's pushing back, so I can more accurately go like halfway down or 3/4 down or 1/4 down or all the way down, and it just feels good. It snaps right back up. They feel really nice with my index fingers using them. I'm not someone who plays like this where I have 2 fingers, one on each side. I usually just use 1 finger and swap, but it feels great with my index finger, and it really captures it enough to where I can really use it to its fullest. So overall, button design, fantastic. I also noticed that when I have my hands here, I'm not actually covering the vent as much, which I actually really like because I hate that covering that vent. So usually when I'm playing, my hands are like this, or at least my right hand is like this. So it's not covering this vent, which is important because you want to get cool air in for cooling. Now, the one big issue, I guess, I have with this design is the power and volume button placement. So right here on the bottom, I'm used to having like the USB-C port for charging and the micro SD card right over here. But we also have the power button and the volume button right here, which honestly just feels awkward. Now, I'm used to having it like on one of the sides or having it on the top. I'm much more used to like going around like this, but having it on the bottom, it just feels weird. It's not necessarily bad, but it's just awkward. I've especially for volume buttons, like maybe I could get the power button down here, but the volume buttons down here, like I'm so used to having them on the sides. So it's a little bit awkward to use when I'm trying to like turn on, like to turn it off, and then having to remember, oh, the button's down here, so let's turn it on, or the volume button is right over here. I would much rather have seen it here on the sides. Now, using the Thor is pretty great in itself, but there is one other issue that I have just using it, which is, again, my fat hands. So having to play, with the Thor out like this, I can't really do long play sessions like this. It cramps up my hands because I have to like reach around like this, and it's not comfortable. That's the other thing. So like with the Steam Deck here, you have these fantastic handles, right? So it's perfect ergonomics to just fit my hand. It rests around the entire palm of my hand. So it really just feels like I'm gripping it. And I love that. I have not really found many handheld PCs that still have that grip. I would say the Legion Go is the closest one, but it's also a little bit too big because, it's a bulky device. The Thor, however, has none. There are no handles whatsoever. And again, it's like the DS in that regard, but I need those handles. Luckily, there is an accessory that AYN is selling that adds grips. It's called the TPU grip. It is an extra accessory and it does cost more. AYN did send me this one with the device, so I got to try it. And honestly, with my hands, it's perfect. So it's super easy to just slide on, just like that. And now it's part of the device, and we have these gigantic handles. Again, does not cover the vent, and it fits my hand perfectly. It feels so much more comfortable to play. This is how I tested the device primarily, was with these handles on. I don't know if I can play without the handles. It is a little bit more difficult to actually open the screen, like especially if you're holding it and you're trying to, push it open. But for the most part, it's not that bad. And honestly, that's probably my biggest issue with the Thor as a whole, would be actually using it without these handles, just getting the Thor itself and not using the handles along with it. The handles really, really make a difference. And I would say is essential, especially if you have like bigger, fatter hands. This grip is going to be probably the greatest accessory that comes along with the Thor that you could possibly get. And really, it's great design. I love that they really went for like the DS, design philosophy for it, and it really works in its favor. Now, I also wanted to make special mention of the screens that it's using. So the Thor actually has two screens. As we talked about before, the top screen is a 1080 by 1920, while the bottom is a 1080 by 1240. But they're both OLED screens, so they have the true blacks and the vibrant colors that I absolutely adore. And it really makes using the device and the gameplay itself just so much better. Now, I love these screens, but there are 2 points that I do want to bring up. The first is 120 hertz refresh rate support. So the top screen is actually 120 hertz rate. And we can switch between whether we're going to do 120 hertz or we're going to do 60 hertz. So I'll go a little bit more into how we're going to fix that or change that. Now that we're in on the device, all we have to do is press the AYN button down here, and you see it says 60 frames per second mode right over there. It's that turquoise bar. You just click it, bam, now we're in 120 frame per second mode. So this will make the top screen work with 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second or 60 hertz and 120 hertz. I haven't really found many reasons to use the 120 hertz mode. The only Android game that really stood out where I could take advantage of it is Wuthering Waves, and that's because it has an in-game frame limit of 40, which feels fantastic, and it's a great compromise, and I recommend using it for Wuthering Waves. But games like Genshin Impact doesn't have that option, so keeping it at 60 made more sense. And ultimately, that's really it. I mean, there are probably other games and other uses for 120 frame per second mode, but as a casual user of Android devices, I don't really see much reason to use the 120 frame per second mode, but it is really nice to have, and I'm sure there are many more use cases that I just haven't explored yet. But as a casual user, it's not something that has really popped up to me, and I was like, okay, I should be using this. The only issue I have with the screens is the bottom screen can get pretty hot. So if you're using it and playing, let's say Wuthering Waves at the high quality settings, if you're playing it for too long, it is going to heat up that bottom screen. It doesn't get too hot to where it is unusable. Like I can still touch it, but I would never keep my hand on it for too long, or else it would, start freaking me out a little bit. It would get a little too hot to the touch. So there is that would be the only actual limit that I could find. One of the big things I really love about having two screens not only is the emulation from dual screen games, but also the ability to multitask. So we can play a game on the top screen while also doing something else on the bottom screen. For example, let's say we want to play Naruto Ultimate Ninja 5, but we're also in the middle of reading some articles from our favorite website, Steam Deck HQ. Well, we can easily do that just by locking the controller to that top screen and continually reading on the bottom. Or let's say we want a little bit help getting through Shadow of the Colossus. Well, we can always pull up the game on our top screen, and on the bottom screen, we could actually be watching a walkthrough video while we're playing, and we can sync it up, so we're doing around the same thing at the same time as the video. There are a multitude of ways that we can utilize this, like playing Game Boy games on the bottom screen and having a Prima Guide up on the top screen, especially helpful for Pokemon. But either way, it's something that we can do, and it's one of my favorite things about the device to be able to do. And we can easily just choose what we want on each screen. Now, I pulled this up to show the 60 and 120 frame per second mode, but the AYN Thor does come with its own device management software, or quick access menu. So it does have its own launcher, which I'm going to discuss first, and then there's this quick access menu down here. So right up here, this is the, normal Android interface. This is what we get with most of our Android devices, and we can, scroll through and see all our apps. The Odin and most AYN devices come with their own launcher. So this is AYN's own launcher that comes with it. It does kind of fine tune the experience. It makes me think of like the Nintendo Switch, but just, with layered boxes. And we do have these side menus here where we can sort our apps, we can change performance modes, joystick light, and over here is brightness, storage, sleep, and we can clean up processes. And, there's wallpapers and layouts that we can change. But for the most part, it's just okay. I don't see the big appeal of using this over the Android interface. It's not bad. It's a nice option to have. I just don't see. I didn't use it. I tried multiple times and I was like, okay, this is cool. This is great to like look around in, but for the most part, it's just there. It's okay. It'll do the job if you want something more simplistic to just get to the apps that you prefer. And if you like to, sort the apps, you totally can. And that is nice to be able to sort the apps like this. But me personally, I was happy to use the interface, the normal interface, which, works best for me. Now, most of those features that I saw in the Odin launcher are all available here with this quick access menu or device management. So you just hit the AYN button right here and it'll pop up this screen. So there are 3 tabs here on the bottom. The first tab over here is mode, which has a couple of really important options that I'd love to go through. So at the top here, we have the ability to turn on or off some displays. So we can turn on the display here. So this display is off and only this one is on. And we could turn back on just by hitting the AYN button. Or we could have it so it's only the bottom screen, which easily we could just, go back to dual screen display or only top screen and just turn that one back on. Right underneath it, we can change the brightness of both screens at the same time and individually, which I think is a fantastic separation. And that extends to the sound quality right over here, or sound volume. So we can actually change the volume of the top and bottom screen independently of each other. So if we have a video playing on the bottom screen and we want to hear it, and whatever's going on the top screen, we don't want any volume at all, we can just turn that off and turn that on. Now the only volume is going to be coming from whatever is on the bottom screen. And I think that's a fantastic option to have. The second button right in the middle is the task button, which honestly just brings up the multitasking menu right over here. And that's basically it. You can also bring it up just by swiping down from the top menu or the top screen, but there's no way to do it from the bottom screen other than using the AYN button. And that's that. Now we have the third option, which is the one where I stick to most of the time. So this has most of our settings. Over here, we have the frame rate. So it's going to be calculating the frame rate, which is accurate sometimes. So when you're playing, like, let's say Genshin Impact and it's at 60 frames per second, this is pretty accurate. However, if you're playing at like a 30 frames per second lock, this is not going to switch to 30, so it will not be accurate. So unless you're playing, whatever you're playing is at 60 frames per second, this should be ignored. Right underneath it, we have the temp and fan speed, and to the right of it, we have the CPU, GPU, power, and RAM usage. So it's showing how much RAM is being used, how much power is being used, and how much CPU and GPU power are being used. And then right above that is going to be some of the best options that you can change with the Thor. So there are 2 options here that I absolutely adore, which is auto lock or locking and direct power supply. Auto lock is a special mode that will lock the controller inputs to one screen. So let's say you're playing a PS2 game on the top screen and you don't want your controller to be, put on the bottom screen. You change this to top screen. This is done because let's say we're going to head over and play God Hand, right? I love God Hand. It's a great game. If we just have auto lock on, whatever screen we press last with our fingers will be where the controller is going to interact with. All right, so we have God Hand up. Now let's just go ahead and press the start button, and you see we are moving it with our controller. However, if I touch that bottom screen, now I'm controlling the bottom screen with the controller, and no more am I controlling God Hand. However, if we turn on auto lock to only be on the top screen, now you see I'm moving that, but my controller is only affecting that top screen. So it's honestly my favorite my favorite option that the Thor has. So now I can only focus the controller on this top screen instead of it on the bottom screen at all. Now, the other option I really like is the direct power supply. So sometimes when I'm sitting at my computer and I'm working, I will have this plugged in and using it while I'm waiting for something to download, or, for whatever reason, I'm usually waiting for it. So I have it plugged in. Now, when it's plugged in and there's no direct power supply option, you'll see that this is still being used. And now it says it's 14.7 or 14.1 fluctuating. And that's because it's charging the battery as I'm using it. Now, this could actually harm the battery and depreciate it faster. However, if I hit direct power supply, you see that power goes all the way down because it's not putting any power specifically to the battery. The power coming into it is only going into the device to actually run it. So instead of it using the battery as a power supply and we're charging at the same time, it'll only use the power coming from the cable. And I love having that as an option. It will help save the battery's life, so it should last longer and not depreciate as fast. Now, if you have this option on when it's not plugged in, there's not really anything that's going to happen. It's still going to use battery power as is, but with the option on, as soon as you plug it in, it starts, it goes all the way down and is no longer being used. And that's great. And I love it that way. It's perfect. So that is my favorite option there. Outside of that, though, other than those two, we can change performance modes right over there. We can change fan speeds. We can clean up memory. So if there's any extra processes going on, we can clean those up so it frees up some RAM. We can change this style of controller between standard and Xbox style. We can turn on vibration or turn it off, and we can turn on the lights for the LEDs for the joysticks. And there's some nice options here. We can change both of them at the same time. We can change left and right separately. And we have a good amount of options here to choose from, as well as some basic options here. The brightness of it. So let's go ahead, turn that down a little bit. It's fluctuating that one right there. And the saturation. So if you want it less or more saturated, you can, as you can see here. And other than that, that would be the only options that are there. And I like the joystick LEDs. I just don't use them as much. I'm not a huge fan of having lights. My computer doesn't even have RGB lighting. But that's essentially all the design and the device management software. I absolutely adore it, and is perfect for how we're going to get into start playing games. So let's go ahead and check out some Android games to see how it's running on the Thor. Genshin Impact was the first game I tested, and I was actually quite surprised to see how much power I could push. Using the high performance setting in AYN, I was able to get 60 frames per second on high settings most of the time. There were a few drops here and there, but ultimately it was still very playable. It may get a little difficult to hit 60 in large fights with tons of effects, but I was able to keep it there in fights with multiple enemies while I used my abilities. I do have to go to the settings to switch the control scheme to controller each time I open the game, but otherwise it was still very playable and enjoyable. Weathering waves also held up quite strongly on the Thor. I started off with the balance preset, and using the high performance mode, I was nicely able to stick to 30 frames per second with some power to spare. I was able to push quality mode at 60 frames per second as well, though I did experience some dips. However, I recommend setting it to 40 frames per second in-game and using the 120 frames per second mode for the best experience with the highest quality settings. I did encounter a couple of crashes after long play sessions, usually after the 2-hour mark, but it was perfectly playable overall. It did also recognize the connected gamepad by default, which I greatly appreciated. Ultimately, this should be able to handle most, if not all, Android games to some degree, and I would say it's very enjoyable to play as is. Just make sure that it has controller support to really maximize what you get from the Thor. While I haven't played a lot with Android devices, I was surprised to learn that you can actually play your Steam games on Android devices, thanks to apps like GameNative, which uses a compatibility layer to run Steam games. While I was able to get some games running, like Hollow Knight, Ball X Pit, and Megabonk, my model of the Thor only has 8 GB of RAM, which limits me to which games I can test out, since a lot of them need a little bit more. The best way to see which games are going to be good to use would be the GameNative compatibility site. You can specify the AYN Thor there, and reports will come up showing which games are running, their rating, and which version of the app is being used. There are a ton of good reports for games like Hades 2, Animal Well, Skyrim, and Ball X Pit. This is one of the games that I was able to get running with my low RAM, and it was just a blast. It isn't perfect, and there were some slowdowns here and there, and I was able to feel it in Ball X Pit and Octopath Traveler 2, but it was still playable, and that alone is pretty awesome. If you're looking to get a device that can play some of your Steam library, I would recommend going for the 12GB or 16GB RAM model, which is going to be the Pro or Max. But if you're looking to play most indies and older titles, having 8GB of RAM should be more than enough. And that translates over to emulation, which is going to be perfect on the Thor. You should be able to handle everything from Game Boy Advance on backwards, and there's really no point in showing it since it's just going to be guaranteed to work. So I want to focus on the games that are going to be the best on the Thor and some of the later generation ones. When looking at the Thor, the first thing you think of is probably the DS, and absolutely, the Thor is perfect for DS and 3DS emulation. I used Melon DS to test, and I tested out a bunch of different games, including COP, which is one of the most demanding games from DS. Using Melon DS, I was able to get an 8 times resolution, which is way more than what you need for the Thor, and it's not really going to be impactful or show up, but I just wanted to make sure it could actually work, and it does. There were a couple of times where it felt like GTA Chinatown Wars did slow down, and there were some cars that popped in here and there out of nowhere, but that could also just be from the DS version of the game, and I don't remember it, having rose-colored glasses on. It was also a joy to go back and play Sonic Rush, which felt fantastic, and using my finger on the bottom screen for those special stages was just perfect. That also translated over to Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, which I really did have a blast getting back into. I know they had a Steam release, which is also great, and I did play that a lot, but it feels different playing it the way that it was meant to be played. I also played some Elite Beat Agents, which is one of the games I loved when I had my original DS, and I played it to death. However, this also showed a little bit where the Thor could not compete with the original DS. There is some input latency, which comes from using an emulator in general, and it is going to be very, very noticeable when playing rhythm-based games on the Thor. So with Elite Beat Agents, I did have a little bit of input lag, so just going by the music, I wasn't able to hit the notes when I needed to. I was able still to make it by going based off the visual cues, but if I didn't have those visual cues and I was just going straight off the music and kind of getting into the beat, I was going to miss some notes. Moving on to 3DS, using Azahar, we can get around 2 times to 3 times resolution depending on the game. Bravely Default worked perfectly at 3x resolution, and honestly, it was a blast to actually play this way. However, games like Monster Hunter Generations started to test the limits, and there were a couple of times where I felt some drops at 3x resolution. So I brought it down to 2x, and while it was still a little bit there, it wasn't as bad. I did try Resident Evil Revelations as well, and really was the only game that felt completely unbearable to play. It just had so many stutters and slowdowns, and it was just not good. Now we can get into some single screen emulation, starting with GameCube and Wii. Dolphin is the emulator that I used, and for the most part can do 2x to 3x resolution without any issues. Going back to play some of the classic games from my childhood that I fell in love with, like One Piece Grand Adventure, was just so much fun. And Sonic Heroes was still just as great as I thought it would be. The only game that really started to show some warning signs was Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2. There were a couple of times where it seemed to slow down a little bit, but it was not nearly as bad as I thought. Wii performance is about the same, especially since they're using the same emulator, though I would say that it's a bit more difficult to play. Having to set the Wii remote up, usually using one of the joysticks, was just not really easy to control. Still, when I played some of the Wii games, including The Last Song, it was very, very playable. To cap things off over on the Nintendo side, we have Wii U emulation. This is using Cemu, and it's okay. 1X is going to be playable for a good chunk of games, but Wii U emulation in general right now is a little bit on the spotty side, mostly due to the graphical issues that just weren't enjoyable. These can be fixed by using a custom turnip GPU driver, which we'll have a link to in the description, but it does come at a cost of performance, and it will slow some games down. As you can see in Rayman Legends, it does slow things down to a crawl when using the turnip emulator. And it does fix some of the graphical issues when compared to the standard version. However, using the default driver does not fix the slowdowns. Those are still there, and now you'll have graphical issues. So I would say Wii U emulation is okay. There might be some games that can just perform and keep going. I did see some footage of like Breath of the Wild running at around 22 frames per second on there with the turnip GPU driver, but I would say don't get this for Wii U emulation. Though it does seem like it could be perfect for it because of the dual screens, and we can set up the external pad to go on the second screen using a specific version of CMU. Luckily, PS2 emulation is going to be pretty much a given. 2x or 3x resolution is going to be pretty doable, and I'd say you could play almost all of it at 3x. Games like GTA San Andreas were perfectly playable even when running around and causing fights and bringing in the police, and God Hand was just a joy to play through. That's a game that I didn't play a lot of after the PS2 era, so it felt really great to get back into it. Shadow of the Colossus did show some warning signs, but ultimately it was still very playable though. And of course, PSP emulation is going to be perfectly fine and playable. I got to go back and enjoy Final Fantasy XII Duo Decim again, and I love the Dissidia games. It was just so great to be able to get back into it, even though I probably need some practice. Then there's PS3 emulation, which is a little bit better than Wii U emulation, but is still going to show some warning signs. Even God of War 1, which is a remaster of a PS2 game, still had some issues. It was able to stay at 60 frames per second, I would say about 90% of the time, but there were enough drops and stutters where it was very noticeable. Battery life is going to be entirely dependent on what you're using on the AYN Thor, so this is just our estimates. If you're going to be doing some hardcore Android gaming like Wuthering Waves, PS3 or Wii U emulation, or you're going to be playing Steam games, I would expect around 2.5 to 3.5 hours of battery life. Then once you start going downwards and you go to Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo DS, PS2, and GameCube, all of these at the same estimated upscaling resolutions that we showcased, I would expect around 5 to 8 hours of battery life. And finally, we can hit the Game Boy Advance, PSP, SNES, lower-end emulation, and just casually using the device. I would expect around 10 to 16 hours of battery life here. There has been some varying reports of how long it has lasted for some people. We did not get to 16, but there are others who have experienced it, and we do trust those sources. Now, the Thor also has its own speakers, so you can play audio outside of it. And the speakers are okay quality. I would say they're expected of handhelds in general. They have this digital sound to it, and they don't have the bass that I like to see through speakers in general, but it's pretty much standard to every handheld. I don't think I've had a handheld or used a handheld that has a good bass to it that makes the sound feel more alive, but it can get pretty loud. I'll turn the volume all the way up so you can hear kind of exactly how loud it can get, but it's solid for what it is. Now that is everything about the AYN Thor, and honestly, I fell in love with it and think it's a necessary part of my handheld arsenal, even though I have a more powerful Steam Deck or Ally or Legion Go. It just gives a completely different experience, and I would say it's pretty reasonably priced. The build quality is fantastic. I love the design. It's very reminiscent and nostalgic for DS and 3DS owners, and I am one of those. The button layout is great. I was able to hit everything with my fingers, and the triggers are solid, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip is really, really powerful. And for $299, I would say that the base model is a fantastic deal and a great companion for the Steam Deck. Now, it's not perfect. If I'm being very nitpicky, the buttons, the power and volume button on the bottom is a little bit weird, and trying to use this without any handles or grips is just really difficult to do, but with that TPU grip, it is much more usable. Even when the screen at the bottom gets a little bit hot, it's still very, very usable, and honestly, I fell in love with it. This is going to be a device I take with me wherever I go. Even though I have a Steam Deck in my backpack, this is just going right in my pocket. and I love it. Now, you can get your Thor over at AYN's website, and I really do highly recommend getting it. If you're going to be playing this mostly for emulation and Android games, the base model should be more than worthwhile. But if you want to start getting into some Steam games with GameNative, and that might require a little bit more RAM, I would look at the Max and the Pro models, though the Max is probably going to be the best one if you're trying to play the most Steam games, since 16 gigabytes of RAM is generally what I would recommend having on your PC in general. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be notified as soon as our next video goes live. This was also my first hardware review video, and I don't do many of these, but we plan on doing more, so if you have any criticisms or recommendations or suggestions that can make future videos better, please let us know. And a huge thank you to our patrons. You guys are awesome. See you next time.